Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and welcome to our two guests tonight, David Cranmer, Underdown, and Nick from Twitter. Nick and David are both guests that I've had the pleasure of interviewing before. So I'm going to skip the background and try to spend our hour that we have together to get into the content that I really want to explore tonight. Without further ado, let me just say hello and how's everybody doing tonight? David, how are you?
I'm doing well, John. Thanks.
All right, and Nick, thanks for joining us again. And how are you doing?
Good evening. I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, as I say, this things are really moving fast right now, and I am grateful to you to put together a couple of, I guess you would call them classes, 100 and 200, introducing your work and then specifically the military programs or, quasi-military programs involving what is called primatology and how this is all related to things like cancer, HIV, and the more recent viruses or pandemics that have been so prevalent in our world. Um, let's dig into the roots of this. And I guess one way to start would be to toss the ball to David, because I know, David, you have also gone through Nick's slide decks and watched his presentations, as have I. So let's start with you, and perhaps you'd like to explore more into some of Nick's work, and go from there.
Sure. So one of the firms that Nick talks about in his presentation is the Merck Corporation, which is a corporation that's very interesting to me because the man that started the biological weapons program for World War II was George Merck from New Jersey, and he brought in a character named Ira Baldwin, who was originally from Indiana, that was the head of the virology program at the University of Wisconsin, and together they created the original Fort Detrick. And then, of course, I'm also always interested in the Vigo Ordnance Factory, which is in Terre Haute, Indiana, which had the Commercial Solvents Corporation right adjacent to it. So those are two characters to me that are really interesting because Vannevar Bush, who runs the National Defense Research Council, when George Merck passes away, he takes over the directorship of the Merck Corporation. So that just ties right into the entire secret defense programs of World War II and how going from an atomic bomb program, the Manhattan Project, the radars, and also creating like penicillin or other medications, and how we went from these war efforts to more secret programs that Nick has talked about.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, let's talk about Merck. And it sounds like from our preamble that we're all sort of interested both in the activities of those players and a particular point on the timeline. So let me just say hello to anyone that has not caught the previous shows. I'm an independent investigator. I did have a brief academic, I wouldn't say career. I did some work with a major university on the West Coast in the space of virology and epidemiology. And because of my personal and professional ethics and convictions about how information was controlled and narratives were controlled, I didn't want to continue inside that framework. So I didn't pursue a lifelong scientific career. But to talk very briefly about the 100 and 200 level programs, I'll just give a one bullet description. The 100 level program is a walk down memory lane. It's a direct timeline progression from the mid 50s to the point that most people became aware of HIV or AIDS in the early 1980s. And I take you through all of that material in a progression. The 200 level takes some of the key aspects of the overall timeline and drills down further, more into scientific, strategic, congressional and federal leadership, and some of those mechanics that occurred. And the 300 level is as yet to be recorded, and that's going to be a drill down on, I think, more of the philosophical underpinnings of it all, which include eugenics, our flirtation, for a long period of the U.S. history, first part of the 20th century, with making lists of people, dehumanizing certain categorizations in society, and some other aspects that are tied to, 300 level will be really more the philosophy with a couple more punctuated scientific sort of smoking guns. So those are all going to be available. We're not going to share documents and materials tonight, so this is a discussion. But what was important for me when I didn't, growing up, I didn't know any of this history. I didn't know a Pfizer from a Merck. But what I learned through the original whistleblowers, including the Strecker brothers, and Cantwell, and Horowitz, and Hooper, is that Merck has played a key and closely tied role to, like you described, David, the essentially the creation of biowarfare, biodefense, as it's now called in the U.S., and a one of those critical early public-private partnerships that allows a federal entity like the Defense Department or an intelligence compartment to put a proprietary barrier around their work if the partner is a corporation. If they're a private corporation, they have rights and they can just put up a firewall. There are other techniques, but so that's a little bit about, what that material is. And tonight, my mind is kind of being drawn to the meeting at Cold Spring Harbor. Now, Cold Spring Harbor has been the host to a great number of discussions and activities over the years. And this particular meeting in 1960 had a cadre of folks from national defense, who are always at the table, if you didn't know this, when it comes to matters of public health, agencies like the NIH, who were at that time, already funding activities that were on the line. They had their toe just over the line. Is it biowarfare? Is it biology? And other players. And among those were Dr. Maurice Hilleman from Merck. So that's one thing that I think would be very interesting. Do you know about that discussion, David? Have you ever seen any of the materials or seen anyone analyze that moment in time?
Just from watching your show, I mean, I'm familiar with Cold Spring Harbor and Plum Island and the the veterinary medicine program that was run out of there. I've watched Mark Kulak talk about the outbreak at the Bronx Zoo and how a lot of the characters were going between Cold Spring Harbor and the Bronx Zoo. So I mean, more general information, like I haven't read the Horowitz book. I mean, I'm aware of it and I've heard people talk about it, but I don't know the specific details of it.
Got it. Yeah, this was pivotal. And when we were kind of doing the preamble and talking about the variety of things connected to these activities, this is a moment where it kind of splits, it bifurcates between these immune suppressing and cancer causing pathogens that were one aspect, that's kind of one channel of the scientific focus. And the storefront for that was, we're fighting cancer. And there were a few, projects that were very, very clearly and well defined. They were coherent cancer studies. Others were not. They were doing virology and biowarfare. And then the other branch, when I said that it splits, is just that, is both the HIV risk and then the cancer risk. And I think it's very interesting, the long-term, we talk about Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, and setting something, Hegelian dialectic, setting something into motion so that you can come forward with a solution. I think that's probably happened in history so much more than we all realize. We would all be shocked. But this is an interesting place where Merck was at the table when they understood very clearly from the materials that were presented by Dr. Eddy, that they're, the products that most of them were producing, because they had started to shift into this primate cell culture, or using monkeys to actually mix viruses and create high concentrations of them, and then they would put that into, they would filter them and put that into a human product. Everyone was at risk of SV40, and that was the main topic. But let me just pause there and see what do you have any, do you have any understanding about Maurice or SV40? Have you explored any of that space?
Well, we've actually, worked with Mark Kulak a good bit, and he's really opened up the book on Maurice Hilleman pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember the details myself, so it'd be good to go through that. And as mentioning your two classes, 100 and 200. I read to 200 today, and I'm still really just reeling from the idea that they really were, um, you know, just transfecting human and chimpanzee and other primates with their blood supplies, just basically running blood from one into the other, and they were doing that a long time before we knew about it, and then the association of that, and then you've really just nailed it. So with all the documentation you have there, that yeah, that they really were doing that, and doing it to people, and we hear about some of the experiments, but I bet you we haven't heard about 90 to 95% of them, because they would have spread it around and kept it quiet. As you've spoken of, SV40, of course. I've spent probably a year and a half studying that and visiting with Ed Haslam and going through Dr. Mary's monkey a number of times. Also interviewed Judith Very Baker, and we we understand the SV40 story from the point of view of Dr. Mary's monkey. What you add to it is that that's just what you call one cell in a whole lot of cells doing similar research around the country. When did they start, to your knowledge, when did they start mixing primate and human serums and trading them back and forth like that?
Okay, so for the listeners that haven't had the advantage of seeing the material, I put up on screen in the 200 level a list of journal entries in a particular journal called the Journal of Medical Primatology. And the two items that I call out are two examples of a direct cross circulation between a human coma patient who clearly couldn't give informed consent, and in one case a baboon, and in the other example a chimpanzee. So to come back to your question, as far as how far back were there experiments on the direct transposition of physical material between animals and people, it goes way back. I mean, those were some quite focused studies, but I see evidence of these kinds of experiments going back into the Nazi work. And I don't want to just say anything that it's scientifically dubious has a Nazi brand on it. That's not the case. There have been transfusion and transplantation experiments. I see, peppered through the literature as far back as I've looked for it into, say, the 30s and 20s. But I mean, I would imagine. I mean, think about the Dark Ages. Think about Europe and
Yeah.
the culture of bleeding yourself to cure.
Sure,
There had to be
sure.
some pretty arcane practices in our past. But yeah,
Yeah,
these were quite pointed.
I just wanted to focus on what appears to be the roots of HIV and our
Hmm.
AIDS and the
Hmm.
the horrible diseases that have come, apparently, according to what your research leads me to believe, from this type of mixing. And while sure that kind of stuff was going on in the Middle Ages, but not by people with PhDs and
Oh
big
no.
defense budgets and laboratories to die for, just to try to make things more and more virulent, more and more deadly, and more
Oh
and more
yeah.
more and more carcinogenic. So, this is a determined, military style research project. And from that, it appears to me that, yeah, sure. Okay, before World War II, we can go to Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. We can look into the Rockefeller Institute before that, and how all the German and American scientists were basically going back and forth and sharing their data. But the kind of supercharged effort that I see happening that leads to HIV, that must be American-led World War II, or just after the end of the World War II. Isn't that a fair statement?
I can't speculate. I think you're close. I would tighten that up by about 5 years by saying it seems like that's why I started my timeline at 1955. That's
Okay.
really where there's kind of a series of papers and issues going off in the press. There was the Cutter incident with the existing polio vaccine formula where several children died. And they began seeing the emergence of these primate diseases. So I think there was a shift in the supply chain. I think practices went from using primates as a test subject, which has been going on as long as there's been human medicine experimentation, versus using them as a part of the engine to generate a human biological product. That's a big shift. So yeah, that seemed to be the mid-50s. They found the junk. They started seeing the presentation of these diseases from, three or four of them, including SV40 and RSV and other primate viruses involved in human leukemia. I'll say that. And then the first, like that Gallo project in 1962 is before the formal beginning. 1964 is allegedly the beginning of the special virus leukemia program. And then within, I think, 3 or 4 years, it turned to cancer, special virus cancer program. And then they dropped the special in the 70s after Nixon came out with his big sexy war on cancer thing and poured more money into it. They dropped special. Specials generally, demarks that it's got some level of classification. So,
Well, let's see, David. Now, you've been looking at this stuff from more of a corporate connections angle, and you mentioned Merck, and so let's go from there. Around 1955, what's going on in the corporate side of this?
Well, one of the areas that I always want to talk about too is the Park Davis Company in Detroit and Wayne State, because the person that's credited with the discovery of AZT is a someone named Jerome Horowitz that from Wayne State University. And what I always try to tie to these Gibson Island conferences, where this idea of sharing military secrets but also medical secrets. The man that was the head of the chemistry department was a man named Neil Gordon, and Neil Gordon was the founder of the Gordon Research Conferences on Gibson Island. So the same person through this Michigan Cancer Center, which later turns into the Karmanos Institute for Cancer, this Wayne State medical researcher discovers AZT. And of course, for people that don't know the geography of Detroit, Wayne State is just a couple blocks from the General Motors headquarters, and also where Charles Kettering would have been doing his, leadership of the General Motors, their research department. Of course, he then becomes the director of the Sloan Kettering Institute, with Alfred Sloan being a General Motors chairman as well. So that's an area that I always like to focus on. Park Davis was an interesting pharmaceutical company that was part of the polio vaccine. It was one of the 5 with Cutter, with along with Wyeth and Eli Lilly, and the other one was a veterinarian medicine in Indiana. I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. But the other thing was that Jonas Salk was, working through the University of Michigan and also as a assistant at Park Davis. So that's where I always go. And like, just like on a personal note, like my grandma, I think worked with all these characters. She was a Michigan medical, or she was a chemist from the University of Michigan. She worked at the Michigan Medical School, Michigan hospitals, and she would also do programs with Cleveland Clinic and the Case Western Reserve, where my great grandfather did his residency. And she was supposedly working on transfusion stuff at the time, but of course she died of cancer in 1966, and of course I never met her. But and then you have the things like the guy that was the chief chemist of Park Davis was also the person that starts this Kresge Hooker Library at Wayne State, which goes back to the 19th century. And to me, I think it is going to be something that sort of ties into these old like Royal Societies. And this Hooker that was collecting this library was what you're talking about, like going back to the the bloodletting and the different philosophies of medicine before we got into the more modern age with the Flexner report. So those are things that I look at. And then of course with Jonas Salk starting the Salk Institute in San Diego, being a leader in AIDS and HIV research, and also with like the David Baltimore having his connection between Cold Spring Harbor and then also out at Salk. So those are the things that sort of I think about. So and also Park Davis also supposedly came up with the first vaccine for cancer called Cooley toxins. So I don't know really much about the details of that, if you've come across that, but this is all in the 40s period more that we're talking about, a little bit before that timeline. But Park Davis is a company that nobody's heard of. Like many things of Detroit, it's just sort of a company that was once the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, and now it's just a shell. There's nothing there.
Let me just jump in, and for those that are not aware, Gibson Island has been a focus of the research here at McDuff Lives, and that's why we call ourselves the Screaming Ospreys, because we had our very first get together in July of 2020. No, 2019. It was before the pandemic. And our goal was to get out to try to see Gibson Island, this legendary island in Maryland that's a little bit south of Baltimore, but turns out to be the home of an awful lot of medical conferences and planning seminars. All kinds of big names that have property there, and including the Miller family from Robert S. Mueller family. And so that was the focus of our work, was to get there and to study that by going out on the boat and seeing the Ospreys. And that formed a bond between a number of people, including myself and David. And so that's just a little background there. The other thing I wanted to do would be to ask Nick or David to just remind me, what is AZT and why was it significant when they discovered it?
I'll take the second piece of that. I'll take the second piece, part B. It's significant because it was a treatment that they pulled off the shelf because it was ineffective. But during the AIDS era, in the try anything, when ACT UP was doing die-ins in downtown New York and in front of the NIH, they said, okay, sure, let's take AZT. But David is discussing, the origin story and the parties involved.
Yeah. So what is AZT? Do we know?
I don't have the background on that, but I can say that it was used for something called the Friend virus, was one of the things that they pulled it off the shelf. And the Friend was a woman. I can't think of her first name, but she was somebody that was trained under Cornelius Rhodes at Sloan Kettering. So it was something that was introduced, again, bringing back this Detroit to Sloan Kettering in New York, which of course is, adjacent to the Rockefeller Hospital and also the the Cornell Wheel Medical Institute, which again, these are all, world famous and key to these stories.
Nick, would you tell us about Cornelius P. Rhodes and his famous letter about the unfortunate humans of Puerto Rico, and how does that fit into your research?
I'm not familiar with that letter.
Oh, okay.
So
Well,
no. That's out of my experience, but I'd like to hear about it.
Well, Cornelius P. Rhodes, David, I guess we would introduce him who he is, but he was one of the key scientists at the Rockefeller Medicine, which is, I guess, it's called something like the Rockefeller Medicine Institute.
Mhm.
And he was, he wrote a letter back, I guess, to the headquarters saying, uh, bragging about how he was able to give cancer to 4 or 5 of the natives of Puerto Rico, who he described as, kind of like these Kipling-esque half humans that were filthy and not worthy of much consideration. And so that racist attitude pervaded the
Sure.
letter. It's not completely conceded that it's genuine, but I think it is. And well, David, tell us about Cornelius P. Rhodes.
He was in Army medicine, and he was stationed in Puerto Rico, and he was one of these characters that was doing the kind of experimentation that Nick's talking about. I think he was under the I think originally was under, I don't know if he was doing doing the like the STDs and penicillin, but he had gotten into this cancer. And the thing that's also a historical thing related to Cornelius Rhodes is that years later, Harry Truman actually has a assassination attempt on him by 2 Puerto Ricans based on their discovery of this letter. And I think it was one of the Secret Service men were killed. And again, it was on West Executive Avenue, which is always curious to me because that's the name that our current Secretary of State named his consulting firm, West Exec, based on West Executive Avenue. And I always hope that that's not why they named it that.
Cornelius Dusty Rhodes was an American pathologist, oncologist, and hospital administrator who was involved in a racist scandal and subsequent whitewashing in the 1930s. Beginning in 1940, he served as director of Memorial Hospital for Cancer Research in New York. From 1945, was the first director of Sloan Kettering Institute and the first director of the combined Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. For his contributions to cancer research, Rhodes was featured on the cover of the June 27, 1949 issue of Time magazine. During his early years with the Rockefeller Institute in the 1930s, Rhodes specialized in anemia and leukemia, working for 6 months in Puerto Rico in 1932 as part of the Rockefeller Foundation International Health Board contingent. During World War II, he worked for the United States Army, helping to develop chemical weapons and set up research centers. Research on mustard gas led to developments for its use in chemotherapy at Sloan Kettering. In 1932, a letter Rhodes had written in November 1931, which disparaged Puerto Ricans and made claims, which he later referred to as jokes. He had intentionally injected cancer cells into his patients, was given by a lab assistant to a Puerto Rican nationalist leader. He publicized the letter in the Puerto Rican press, and what David described happened next. So yes, he was bragging that he injected cancer, and I think he also bragged that 4 of his subjects died. That to me, that's typical Rockefeller medicine, frankly, and I don't trust anything that comes out of the Rockefeller Institute of Medicine. So there's one thing that really does make me angry, that a Rockefeller Institute of Medicine should be there for the good of mankind, but look what they do.
Well, it's a very difficult awakening, or coming out of the cave out into the bright light, to understand that behind the curtain on a lot of things in life and in the world and in our history. Things that were framed and had optics of being humanitarian and uplifting society and sheltering and providing great services for the poor. That again, there's that iceberg component of what you see at the top and what's occurring down underneath. So yes, I have only seen in scholars that I deeply respect, including ones who've written about GMOs, and that being another one of these larger sort of transnational enterprises, and a long arc and other topics, but they really bring to light the duality and the sort of the branding that I joke about it in the talks. I say it's a mullet. It's business up front, party in the back. But that parallel construction of things that are occurring in these entities you're mentioning, the hospitals, the institutions that are branded and are promoted, and I'll say propagandized in a certain light, when there are other activities and things occurring that would call great public scrutiny and indeed are clearly criminal, but they get to be bifurcated and segmented out into all of these little honeycomb cells, and that's coming back to Dr. Mary's monkey, this instance that you're calling out about the work in Puerto Rico. All of these little instances do cluster together. So here's a question that's sort of welling up for me as I'm listening to you guys share this wonderful history, is what happened to the American eugenicists? I mean, I know about Carnegie funding the American Eugenics Society in Cold Spring Harbor up to a point. And then when public opinion turned because Mein Kampf came out and praised the California Eugenics Society and said, we need to do as the Americans are doing, that was bad press for them. As I understand it, at a tertiary level, I haven't seen a lot of material from, say, 45 to 55 and traced individuals as they sort of scurried off the boat. But what do you guys know about that space, about eugenicists and these sorts of institutions that you're talking about?
Yeah,
I
I'll take it, David. That the answer to that, I think, is the Green Revolution. Once again, it's a Rockefeller based project, and instead of coming right out and saying we are overpopulated or we need to improve the race by certain restrictions on birth, instead of coming right out and saying that, they repackaged everything into environmentalism. And this is where they went. They went into the green revolution, and a guy named Maurice Strong and the beginning of Earth Day and all that. So that's where they went. That all leads into the
So they co-opted the
Paul
hippie
Ehrlich.
movement?
Well, the hippie movement, yeah. Well, there's a whole show right there. I mean,
Yeah, well, I'm just I'm trying to think this forward through
Kissinger,
time,
but
and what sort of sociologic trappings did it wear as it progressed? Because you're reminding me of Kissinger's paper
right,
and
that's it.
Bush's paper and Agenda 2021, 2030, et cetera. So
In SSM 200, and that's it. The Schiller Institute and the LaRouche folks have done a great job of tying that those loose ends together. The Cold Spring Harbor, from eugenics to this quasi environmentalism, which is really just another way of addressing population control. When you say sustainability, right? Sustainability of what? Well, they're talking about sustainability of their elite financial system, which depends upon culling the population from time to time. That's the way I see it.
the
well,
the
that's
thing
how
I
Kissinger wrote it in the 1950s. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
David, please.
No, go ahead. No, Kissinger was in charge of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund special projects, which was launched with Sputnik. What was that? 57, I believe, was when Sputnik is launched. But the people that I want to draw out as far as the eugenics movement and who becomes the eugenicist.
Mhm.
The character that I always want to talk about is a guy named Horace Rowland Gaither, and he was hired by the Ford Foundation when Henry Ford II takes over Ford Motor. The Ford family kind of gets out of the auto business and goes into the Ford Foundation. They take Rand Corporation from Douglas Aviation, and then they make it a Ford Foundation program and move it to Santa Monica. He also creates MITRE Corporation, which is involved in a lot of biological and
Oh.
chemical warfare programs. And
Yeah.
he also starts the first hedge fund with a man named William Draper, who was the head of the Population Control Committee. His grandson is very famous as Tim Draper now, who was the major original sponsor of the Thermanos company, which basically I think has every eugenicist character you could draw out, including Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and different characters like that. And then to me, it just rolls right. They kind of have Tyler Schultz, the grandson of George Shultz, be the whistleblower and blame the whole thing on the girl Elizabeth Holmes, and then they just start up with the nuclear threat initiative, and now you've got your Margaret Hamburgs right in the picture, and of course she's very deeply tied with the let's see, she was the head of the FDA and Health and Human Services. You've got your Sylvia Burwell, who is the head of HHS. That's at American U. American U has a rich history in chemical and biological warfare going back to World War I, which again kind of got moved out to Fort Detrick and out to the other military base in I can't remember the name of it, but that's where I see that. I mean, like all this stuff is hard for me because like one of the major eugenicist guys is a guy named David Starr Jordan, who was the president of Indiana University that then heads out to become the first president of Stanford. So, Herbert Hoover is one of my number one darkest characters of the 20th century. And, I look at the Hoover Institute and the Stanford Research Institute and all, that's an area where I think a lot of these old eugenics ideas have sort of been rebranded as either fighting cancer, fighting disease, or green revolution.
They became the microbiologists and they became the geneticists in many cases. Now, if we just had a room covered in corkboard and we both had, all had spools of red ribbon and a box of push pins, think of the fun we would have right now. Let's shift over one click and talk about the synchronicities or the interesting, the call outs that come to mind when we bring in paper clips. And I'm also talking about Lebensborn, and I'm talking about later collections that came up from South America and their activities, institutions, and progenies. I don't know that that's necessarily, we've got time to go down that rabbit hole, but are either of you aware of alignments or consistencies in those circles?
Yeah. I mean, look at Ira Baldwin at the University of Wisconsin. His student is Sidney Gottlieb. Sidney Gottlieb goes to Camp King in Oberasnau, Germany, where they bring in Reinhard Gehlen, and they're doing the advanced interrogation program there with Kurt Blom, and with young Henry Kissinger is also in that program. And then, of course, Gottlieb then comes back and becomes the, director of the, what do they call it? Not executive action. He becomes the director of basically poison. I mean, I don't want to say assassinations, but that's basically what it is.
He is called Poisoner in Chief by Stephen Kinzer. That's the name of his book, Sidney Gottlieb, Poisoner in Chief. And let's not forget that also you have Richard Bissell, you have Wisner, of course. These CIA spooks from the old OSS that they don't have any problem with assassination one bit, and they're looking for ways to assassinate people without it being known. Give them a little cancer that's not going to hit them for a year or two. I think that's what happened to my dad. I think it happened to a lot of people, and I think it's going on a lot all over the world right now. I am absolutely sure the paperclip program was tied into it. And one thing you haven't become familiar with my dad's story, I don't think yet, is that my dad apparently, when he was with the FBI, was involved in screening applications for residency permits from Eastern
Mm.
Europeans, from people with sketchy backgrounds that
Hmm.
the CIA wanted to bring into the country. Sure, Kurt Bloma. I mean, just as yeah, there's hundreds and hundreds of pins and red ribbons to tie all that together for sure. And we have done a lot of work. The group that we're with here. And by the way, I see Housatonic is here in the chat room, and a shout out to him. And thanks for his very, very thorough and hard work.
Oh, we're honored by his presence. Seriously. So I would assume we are on a fixed clock. We've got what, 10 or 15 minutes left.
Well, yeah, we can go over a little as far as I'm concerned. Is that all right with you,
Okay.
David?
Yeah, I'm fine going.
Okay,
Okay.
let's try to wrap it up by 9:15 if you don't mind, just because I get tired.
Yeah. It takes there's some you gotta have the juice charged up for discussions like this.
But yeah, this is
Okay.
fun because you have opened a lot of connections that we can help with, and
Mm-hmm.
help us with a lot, especially I really wanted to get into the Hep B and
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of it is on your course material, but just for the sake of bringing that into this discussion and people's radar tonight, because when my dad was recruited from the FBI to go to head the planners of the Pentagon when Kennedy took special ops away from the CIA and fired Bissell and Dulles and Cabell, he created this Pentagon office called SACSA, and my dad was drafted to be the head planner for all of the American special ops, whether military or spook or whatever. And at that moment, he became infected with hepatitis and nearly died. Recovered, and lived for another 6, 7, 8 years, and then died of cancer, uh, which was a
Of
fast
the
forward
liver.
of cancer. Yes, absolutely, of the liver. Yeah, also
Okay.
the kidneys and the. I think we were told it had started in the pancreas. It was metastasized through, and it actually had it in his lungs too. By the time he died, I remember my
Mm.
grandfather told me that was what they said. That's when you have these things called coin cells in your lungs, then that's it. You can't recover. So it was in his lungs as well. But I think the attack, the hepatitis attack, would have weakened his immune system, and then they may have been some other way later to instigate the actual uh, downfall medically to his death. But I don't want to spend the next 15 minutes talking about the details of my dad, but I want people to understand this is happening in 1962, and I had no idea that they had isolated or were able to identify something called hepatitis B before that time until you explained that to me. So yeah, I'm very interested in just when did they first isolate it to your knowledge, and is this something that they might have created like those primate uh, sourced viruses? I'm just speculating. What do you think?
Well, I see in the literature three different sort of generations, sort of layers of what hepatitis B was called. It was called Dane particles, like a Great Dane with a capital D at one point. And that's generally a behavior that when somebody first says, hey, Eureka, I have found something here under the microscope from a disease or something, a sample, an isolate, they put their name on it, or they put the institution's name on it. Then it was called AUAG. So AU-AG, which sounds, like something off the periodic chart. That's for the Australian antigen. That was another layer of the name. And then they start putting a geography on it and saying, oh, well, it came from Australia. And then the next thing you know, it's called hepatitis B. So I find you can just do a keyword search on any of the major, there's all kinds of academic aggregates, or you can go right to the Federal Paper Archives and you can find, if you look for Dane particles, you'll find much earlier activities, mention citations about where it was found, what kind of activities were occurring that might have caused it to get into a person, what did they do with it from there. But that's part of why it's good to be a little bit of a historian. If you care about something like this, you need to look at how something might have been shifted or relabeled. So that's to help you for your digging. And I think that definitely by 1962, there's clear evidence that remember I told you they didn't start formally the SVLP until 64, but there was a whole cluster like that Gallo experiment, or that Gallo program, where he was taking care of primates across a network in the US. They were insourcing the raw material and creating breeding farms and hooking up with biological suppliers. Think of them as butchers who would take an animal when a scientist needed a fractional component, like its blood or an isolate from the blood or a particular type of tissue, an organ, whatever. And he was part of a group that helped create that whole supply chain. And in the same project was responsible for looking and examining and exploring for new pathogens from the primates that would cause cancer, which is what SIV and HIV are. So yes, there's precedent for it. There's demonstrated commercial exposure of the public to disease-causing pathogens that preceded that point in time. One thing that I do want to emphasize is if you look at contemporary hepatitis B and liver cancer correlation, you'll find that they're finally coming out of the closet about how much liver cancer is rooted in a long-term latent hep B infection. And that can be a 5-year horizon. It could be a 20-year horizon. It varies based on what else has happened in the person's body, their genetics, etc. That's, I hope, grounding for you as far as just a little fact about hepatitis B. But another piece of it that's not grounding is that, yes, they were charging forward into this roulette wheel of mixing this with that, passaging it through a new animal type, a new cell culture type, trying to get it into people, going after the most exotic and strange things that emulated natural disease. They eventually would present a major disease that was disabling or fatal. But they wanted surreptitious agents. They wanted, inoculants and things they could spray. So
Have you ever heard of the Health Authorization Committee?
it rings a bell, but I personally have read, I don't think I have the encyclopedic memory that David does, but I have read literally hundreds, if not thousands of abbreviations. I can't remember any details about that.
Well, it was a high-level CIA program where they tried to figure out exactly that. How are we going to kill somebody without anybody knowing that we killed them? And
Sure.
but it's not only killing them; it's also altering their health, so that if somebody gets appointed to a position of that's maybe a threat to them, uh, maybe the person has an accident, or gets polio, or has some other thing that comes down, and the reason that it's just
A drive through downtown Dallas.
it well, yeah, but not necessarily the headshot, just to disable somebody enough that they don't function at 100%. And maybe I remember that Wayne Madsen told me an example of what they did to a guy that was an accountant, and they somehow put him in a wheelchair, and that was useful to them because he couldn't get from place to place faster than they could, because they could get there first and put their story out first and get to the information first. That health alteration doesn't, they didn't have to kill him, they just compromised their health. And you know, hepatitis is a good way to compromise somebody's health, I think. And once again, that goes to my personal story. But let's spend a little time on just some more broader, just tossing out questions in a broad way. What do you think that, I mean, maybe David, you- what do you guys think is the real goal here? Are they trying to release stuff into the general bloodstream of humanity that's going to generally limit the age, life expectancies, and fertility of humanity? Are they not really trying to do that, but rather they're just uh, experimenting with stuff that they want to just see what happens? Like they want to see the horses go around the track. You know, what happens if we spray this on this population? Let's watch and just do the experiment out of a macabre sense of scientific inquiry. Uh, what's what's motivating this? Anybody?
Yeah, well, the thing I want to get into is the topic that Mark Kulak's been on recently, and that's the remdesivir, because that brings in a lot of these same characters. It brings in George Schultz. It brings in Donald Rumsfeld. It also brings in a character that I think we should study is Bino Schmidt, who had a history with Jock Whitney as a investment banker, but he was also the person that was in charge of the war on cancer in 1972. He was the man positioned as the head of the war on cancer program, and then he becomes a director of Gilead Sciences. So this whole remdesivir, I guess my question is it being used like an AZT where it's, I don't know. I mean, but that's kind of what I've been thinking about. I mean, you talk about the the historical eugenics and what's the purpose. Another character that I think of with this health alteration was a guy named Desmond Fitzgerald that was supposedly in line to be the head of the CIA, and I think became paralyzed from the waist down from, I think, polio. But he's somebody that I think was altered, but his background's very interesting because his wife was the divorced him, but she was the one that was with Stevenson when he died of a heart attack in London when he was the ambassador to England. So there's a
Well,
lot
which
of intrigue.
Stevenson? Oh, Adlai Stevenson.
Stevenson, yeah, she was his girlfriend or whatever. But Desmond Fitzgerald became paralyzed, and he was somebody that worked with the same group with Wisner and was a big OSS to CIA guy that I think was deputy director, but really the Gilead Sciences, and then sort of what Mark has been throwing out as the sort of the ZMapp versus remdesivir being these different therapeutics. That's something that I'm really interested in because that seems like that's something that's really been, offered to the entire global population almost. I mean, so that's something that I'm thinking about.
Nick, to what
I,
extent are you into the different therapeutic, as opposed to the vaccine? So we haven't talked about the therapeutics with you, but remdesivir has been a hot topic on Mark's show, and I agree with David. I'd like to hear what you have to say about Gilead and remdesivir.
I'd like to stop and first just thank everyone out there who's helping with any little piece of this.
Yeah.
Whether you think of yourself as a scientist or a researcher, or you have a legitimate academic or bench, lab science background, thank you for your work and for all the bits and pieces. When we talk about a honeycomb, all the little cells do fit together, and it's important putting the puzzle together. So coming back to remdesivir and AZT, I'm definitely going to sit in the back seat and watch the people who have their teeth and fangs into this take us forward. I'm very interested in the concept of immediate visibility, transparency into the plan, the patents, the positioning, the enterprise. if that's what it is, which it looks like it is, and certainly relate it to what they did with AZT. AZT was, like we said earlier, just on the shelf. It was horribly, horribly toxic. And I watched, as a young gay guy, I watched, people that were positive bring giant bottles of stuff to a restaurant. You would see who was pos, and it was a horrifying experience. And it sickened everything. It killed everything. What we know now about the microbiome, clearly, and its connection to cognition and our immune system, it's massive. It wiped out the microbiome, the marrow, everything. So it was a nightmare to watch people die of that. And I feel so much compassion for everyone who's had loss in these last 3 years about all of this. And I think that's important to call out, that we don't have these conversations because we're fascinated or we have a fixation or we're nerds. There's a driving moral and ethical piece behind it that is I just want to acknowledge for everybody that does their part. Thank you very much. So those are some thoughts.
All right. Yeah, and I tend to agree with you. I think Mark, Housatonic Live is at the tip of the spear on this fight of trying to understand why. Why did they push so hard for remdesivir? It can't, as he says, it can't just be a profit motive. His speculation is that it's research. It's like, well, that somehow the scientists have gotten it into their head that it's okay to do this because it's going to create so much more knowledge that we're going to be able to extend human life and have these amazing qualities of life and abilities that you can maybe genetically program into your children. And it sounds like a bill of goods that we're going to get this wonderful, wonderful thing. But as he said in the show today, it may be one of those pies in the sky that you never really attain. But what's the damage that you're doing while you're trying to get there? Do you, Nick? Do you see any idea that maybe these scientists think that they're doing something ultimately good that's going to improve life and humanity?
I'm trying so hard not to reach out with my imagination to what motive could be in the players that we're all is chasing after. I know that there is a whole lot of psychopathy. I know there's a whole lot of chemical induced sociopathic crap in sort of the ranks, between your generals to your grunts. Um, I've seen all of the press about all of the leverage and that they get on each other and this strange sort of game that's going on. So I think that there are batches of people, and I mentioned, I don't know if it was your show, it might have been with Mark. But I called out and said, way to go, nurses and doctors, pathologists and oncologists, et cetera, that are breaking through and putting themselves at risk and speaking the truth. Way to go. Thank you. History will thank you. Just because that gives us more than just anecdotal things and insights into the death rates, the side effects, what's effective, the timing of treatments, all of that. We're starting to see some cracks in the dam, and that's sort of a silver lining there.
Another thing that came out from Mark, and I think he's he will tell you it's not his original finding, but I think he's really latched on to something important, and that is that the COVID that people are, at least a lot of them are getting sick with. It appears to be that the germ, or whatever you want to call it, the virus, okay, I'll say virus, has been cloned. And so if it's absolutely identical, whether it comes out in one city or another, or without any particular viral transmission connection, they just happen to be exactly the same bug, down to the little Marshall. It's obviously that they've been cloned, and that puts it into a lab origin, and it also puts it into a very highly sophisticated military grade lab origin, like, like the aerosolized anthrax, for instance, that we faced 10, 15 years ago. What was that, 20 years ago now? But
Yeah.
that's a signature along the lines of what all of that you've turned up, that there is a very sinister program here to try to create a death uh, through through the blood supply. It's horrible, David.
It
Well,
is. It is.
my
David,
personal
go ahead.
experience with that was when I was in about second grade. We used to drive down to Bloomington all the time, and my cousin, who was a couple of years older than me, had the blood transfusion, and that was right in the window when there was all the fear with Ryan White and the what was
Hmm.
blood supply tainted. And I just remember the true fear in my parents and my grandparents, who were normally so just like grounded or whatever, and that really affected me. And I know Nick talks a lot about the chimpanzees, but I mean, I even think of like the Michael Jackson visiting Ryan White, and then with him with the Bubbles, the chimpanzee, and then having of course, Bush, HW creating the Ryan White Act for AIDS, and then his son doing the PEPFAR program in Africa, and with Burks being a key figure in the task force, their backgrounds. I it's I don't know. I mean, I haven't met any of the. It's hard to believe that there would be these dark programs that they would roll out like this. But the thing I fear is that the whole cancer moonshot is tied into it, and the idea is that my fear is that the plan or whatever is to have people sick enough where they are completely dependent upon the medical treatment that only they can offer. But again, I mean, it's so extreme, but that's what I worry about. I just hope that that's not what the idea behind all this is.
There's a lot of black and white history, not so far back, but and in some cases going very far back, about these very horrible worst case scenario, negative fantasy scenarios that we hear about. It's going to be, we've seen it in movies. We can talk about predictive programming. We've seen it in writing. I've seen it in the writing of one of Hitler's doctors. His close personal doctor had a personal fascination with the possibilities that lied in an inoculant sourced epidemic. That's what he wrote about, among other things, among all the chemical concoctions he was using to keep the fear propped up. But we have to face all of that. We can't be overwhelmed by that it appears to be evil, because we just shine light in it and we stay one step ahead. There's people out there right now listening to all of our work and tracking how close are we getting to dangerous content, what sort of a viewership do we have, all of that they take into account as far as our risk potential to the system, to the machine. And we need to be innovative in ways that we don't communicate, we don't broadcast, we don't share on our shows about how we are permeating a broader network to make sure that if something happens to us, if we accidentally fall off a parking garage, that that our work isn't lost, and that it can continue without losing traction. So I'm very fierce about hope. And my little Twitter handle, if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's on the screen here. I have Semper Spe, which is always hopeful. And that came from surviving that horrible experience when all of society seemed the whole world was really turned against us, and we were deeply afraid of being rounded up, like we just saw happen in Australia and other examples. So, I think we can learn from the tragedy and try to do a force multiplier together, and make some good, innovative approach to the structure of our information, the translation of it into meaningful and approachable content. Because when we all get into scientific and history jargon, a lot of people tune out. They, they nod off. But we need to be able to package it in such a way that it can be sort of like a data type definition. It can be related and interrelated to other events, other locations, etc., and build it out in blockchain. I don't know, how it's going to manifest, but I really appreciate the opportunity to meet you, David, and to spend more time with you tonight, John.
Well, I have another opportunity for you guys. I understand from Catherine Jumping Mouse, who's been active putting together our December calendar, that you guys are going to join me again in December. I think we've got December 28th marked out. And speaking of Mark, I'm going to see if Mark can join us for that, and maybe have our first quartet here at McDuff Lives if he's available. Yeah, this has been exciting for me, and I really do appreciate it that if there's something that one of us knows that the other one doesn't know, we just freely share it, and there's because there's so much out there that we have to but again, force multiplier is a great term for what I see happening here, because and in terms of risk, I mean, what could be more risky than exposing the fact that they've been playing around with simian viruses in human blood for the past 50 years and proving it, with, paper and real documents and data and statistics and uh, I mean, it's got to be threatening to them at some point. So, yeah, again, a network. They couldn't stop if we keep on adding our value to one another. And so, it's been a great evening for me. I really learned a lot. David, Nick, come back again soon, and we'll continue this work together. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
All right.
guys.
All right, Nick.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, have a good evening. Bye now.